Hey, good people. Grits or cream of wheat? Who the hell is racist? Does anyone ever ask if they touch your hair?
Black Like Me.
You're listening to Black Like Me with Dr. Alex G., a podcast that invites you to experience the world through the perspective of one black man, one conversation, one story, or even one rant at a time. Here's Dr. G.
Black Like Me.
Hey, good people. I want to welcome you back to another exciting episode of Black Like Me with Dr. Alex G. History is so important to us. And the older I get, the more important it becomes. I wish it could have been this important in second or third grade when I first started learning history. It just didn't seem relevant. Some people are afraid of looking back because they think that it impedes forward movement. And nothing could be further from the truth. I think historians would say that we look back in order to not repeat the issues and the struggles and the mistakes of the past. And so in this episode, you're going to see an example of the powerfulness of not only thinking about history, but how we can creatively, artistically bring aspects of history into the future. Again, not to further divide us. I really don't know if we can be any more further divided than we are, but how it could unite us around a common history so that we might be compelled to create a common solution that moves us ahead in greater unity. But before I jump into that, let me just say that I am really excited that we have 2 new Patreon supporters. So I want to give a shout out to Annie Collier and to William Walter. Thank you all so much. Hey, the Patreon family is growing. It's allowing us to do exciting things and to make sure that we keep bringing you this quality, exciting podcast. And so take a moment, click on the link, take a look at the different options. We would love to have you be a part of that family as well. We need you, and we would love to have you help us to continue to get these great these interviews out. A few weeks ago, I was reading the news. I like to get up in the morning and catch the news on my iPhone. And I was reading a news by NBC News, and it was talking about this gentleman that was doing something that's called historical interpretation. And so that intrigued me because I love history. So I started reading about it. And there's this gentleman named Joseph Rogers who lives in Virginia who uses historical interpretation as an act of public service. He reenacts the life of slaves. And he does this in arenas and places. I don't mean physical arenas, but in spaces where the audience is mixed racially. And he helps to allow people to connect with the truth about land grabs and exploitation and dehumanization and legal exclusion.
My name is James Apostle Fields. But once you've had that taste of freedom, it is not an easy thing to wash away. So when we stopped at a tavern halfway between that plantation in Richmond, and when the overseer tied my legs to a stove and went into the next room to go to sleep, that's when I started working.
This really intrigued me because I've just gotten back from Ghana. I was part of the Year of the Return, the 1619 pilgrimage back to West Africa, because the first Africans were taken from Ghana and brought to the U.S. in 1619. So not only is the U.S. looking at this, but the nation's really looking at what does this mean to have had 400 years of this transatlantic slave trade enterprise going on, and what has been the impact of it. And so I am so proud that I was able to work with my team, find this young man. We hunted him down. And so I want to say to you, Mr. Rogers, welcome to Black Like Me. How are you doing today, sir?
Oh, thank you very much, Dr. G. It's a pleasure to be on. I'm doing quite well. I'm excited to be here.
Man, well, I'm really excited too. Hey, listen, I'm going to get into some key questions about your work, but because you're my guest on Black Like Me, I've got to ask you a few black ice breakers. And so something I do with each guest, just to know who I'm working with, sir. So grits, growing up, sir, grits or cream of wheat? What was your hot cereal of choice?
Oh, it was absolutely grits. I got to tell you, look, my mom and I are from Roanoke, Virginia.
Okay.
We moved up to Pennsylvania for a little bit, but every single meal was grits.
I love it.
The butter on top, let it melt.
I knew we were going to get along, Mr. Rogers. I knew we were. Now, here's where we might differ, but there's no black monolith. Did you put salt on top of that butter or sugar on top of that butter?
All right. So I wasn't allowed to do a lot of sugar, so salt was more of my thing.
Gotcha.
I wish I could have done more sugar, but that was for the Rice Krispie treats, and then I would put in too much, and Mom would get on my case about that. So, I wasn't allowed to really have control over the sugar, but I had the salt.
Got you. So let me also ask you, I'm sure that you were just an impeccable child. I mean, you were playing, young Booker T. Washington at 3 years old, so you probably didn't get spankings very often. But on the occasion that you did your mom or dad give you syllable spankings like, didn't I tell you not to? Did you get those growing up?
I got a couple. Now, let's see. Actually, famously, at least in the family circle, right? She broke about 3 wooden spoons on my behind.
Maybe you weren't that good.
One that didn't break. Don't you know that wooden spoon disappeared after a while? So I'm just putting that out to you that way.
Oh my goodness, man. All right, no, that's good. Now, I would love to ask you a whole bunch of other. Well, let me ask you one more: sweet potato pie or pumpkin pie growing up?
I actually really like sweet potato pie. I like that a lot. The texture was just my favorite.
Oh, got you. I got you, man. Well, listen, I would love to have more time to talk with you, but there's so many intriguing things about your background. And so I'm just curious, when NBC News picked up that story and talked about you, did you have any idea that folks in Wisconsin will be reading it and getting intrigued and wanting to have you on a podcast show?
No, I did not. And really, man, it's been phenomenal, the amount of reach that it's been getting, and the amount of people who've been talking about it and contacting me. And it's been a real honor to know that that's been getting out farther than I ever could have possibly imagined. Well,
man, your work it's intriguing. I had a chance to watch a little bit of it on the video clip. I've read up about your great grandfather. We'll get into him in just a bit, but I appreciate your work and also the genealogical journey. I just dropped a podcast series earlier this year, I think, because I've been tracing my roots and actually found the G plantation that my family is from in Leake County, Mississippi, and have actually met some of my white relatives who are G's. Some of them still have the G name. Some of them are G by blood, but they're through marriage, their names have changed, of course. And so I'm intrigued when people are trying to tie their history with their present. And so I'm involved with a lot of racial healing and empowerment work in our city because there's a lot of divide. And so I won't get into all of that, but studying my own genealogy empowers me. It almost commissions me to want to do something, to be a stalwart or to be a catalyst in racial healing. And part of it involves understanding the truth of history. And I realize that I live in a very progressive or self-proclaimed progressive community. It's Madison, Wisconsin, a major university here, the University of Wisconsin. I'm a graduate of it. I love it. But sometimes we ride on the laurels of our success and our progressive nature that we don't really do the real work of working through race relations. And so I'm curious. I'll just start off by asking, are you on a similar journey that by understanding the impact of slavery and these systems on your own family, particularly through Mr. James Apostle Fields, has that somehow understanding his story and wanting to tell it, do you feel that that's empowering you to be able to be more effective in being a catalyst for bringing about racial healing and an understanding about our past?
Absolutely. The short answer, yes. I mean, looking at what James did and what his mother, Martha Ann, did in order to seize their own freedom and make their own way.
Right.
They took a tremendous risk. And this is all in the context surrounding the Civil War, but it's all happening, and the chances that they took, the risks that they took,
yes,
and then what they did afterwards is inspiring on a completely other level. I mean, James, not to get into too much of his story right now, but he goes on even after the war to start going to night school until he gets enrolled in Hampton Normal School, now Hampton University. Then he ends up in Howard. Then he ends up as a lawyer. He keeps on working.
And the House of Delegates
until the day he died.
Didn't he serve in the Virginia House of Delegates?
Yep, he was serving in the Virginia House of Delegates.
That's
was
amazing.
The last of 3 African Americans to actually serve in the House of Delegates before the Jim Crow era segregation. He would be the last one for the next 75 years.
Wow. And what's so powerful about his story, and again, we'll get into him more a little bit later, is that his footprint, his impact on society is too large to be just your great grandfather. I want to study him more. I think he was part of, I think I read of when he graduated his first degree before going to Howard, was he at Hampton? Am I getting that right?
Yes, he was at Hampton. Then it was Hampton Normal School and Agricultural Institute.
But wasn't he part of their?
Was,
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Please go ahead.
Yeah, no. He was part of he was the first graduating.
That's what I was going to say.
University.
Right. So you just think people are enslaved and they still have this brilliance, all of these things that, he's doing, So anyway, I will get into him a little bit later because I'm intrigued by him. But what I'm saying is I'm going to steal your great-grandfather because that figure is so powerful that he needs to be in history books, man. People Absolutely. Need to know and talk about this because really many of us have someone like that in our families and we need to draw strength from it. So I'll just mention, one, I'm excited. You have this new role. You're at the American Civil War Museum in Richmond. Starting later this week or next week, you're going to become the education programs manager for the American Civil War Museum. And that's excellent. And I'm sure that's going to give you just more opportunities to share the information that you're learning and just having more venues. And so talk to me about historical interpretation. You went to work one day with your mom was doing some work and you started acting at 3. I mean, didn't you portray a young Booker T. Washington when you were 3 years old?
Yes. So when I was 3 years old, my mother, who was working for the National Park Service, still does, she brought me with her to Booker T. Washington National Historic Site. She decided that she wanted to do this new living history program as part of historical interpretation. And she had us dressed up. She was in her outfit, wearing the attire. I was in a little flax sack that she popped over my head, popped the arms out the sides, gave me a carrot. I was running around the plantation saying, "I'm Baby Booker." Doing the whole nine. And the other part of it too was she tells me this story about when we were getting this started, because there were some white coworkers of hers too, and they brought their children, and so it wasn't just me out there. But the girl that I was playing with, she was the daughter of one of the white coworkers, and she was in her uniform and her little garb and her attire, and I'm in mine, and we're running around the plantation together. And at a point where we have to get into character now.
Right.
We have to actually go out and do the things, and my mom has to pull me away. And she brings me over and she sits me down, and I said, "I want to go keep on playing with her." And she has to say to me, "Well, we can't do that. Like, that's not our place right now." And that's like the start of something right there. Like, that's not something I could do because we were being in character, and I just knew her as this girl that I just met, really wanted to play around, talk to, at 3 years old, not really thinking about the rest of it. And so,
right.
That's what's all going on behind that too. And it really does start the journey that I ultimately end up with now.
That's amazing. So just explain to folks a little bit about what historical interpretation is. And then I just want to ask you about how you got into this current, role and how you were able to create a platform to be able to embody your great grandfather. But could you just give us just a thumbnail sketch of what historical interpretation is for folks who are new to the concept?
Yes, absolutely. So in the broad sense, historical interpretation is taking the facts, looking at the history, and then being able to relay it in a way that is digestible, that people who are actually listening to it, will be able to get it, right? So that people can understand what happened in the past. In the specific way that we do it through living history is that we actually embody those characters. We put on the clothes, we put on the attire, and we put ourselves in that mindset of that time so that we can accurately portray to people in front of their faces and have them interact with us in a way that they understand that these were living people, that these were real people, and that they had similar feelings and emotions to us. And so when you see that, when you're confronted with that, it's much more powerful than just reading it in the book.
Oh man, I imagine that's incredibly powerful. From the snippet I watched on YouTube, it took me into the story. I mean, it transports you in a little, in some ways. I mean, theater has that power anyway, but it pulls you into that time frame. How do you prepare for that character, and what do you do to get back out of that character to coming back to being Joseph Rogers?
So there's a very definitive shift that I have with my physicality.
It's got to be.
Yeah, absolutely, because there's so much that goes on to it. And if I carry myself in that same way in other spaces, I don't want to lose myself, right?
Wow.
But really, it is about knowing these people by doing the research. So for James Field, I have spent hours. Probably, if we put it all together, I'd probably spend a good 2 weeks in libraries looking up different things about him, looking up the actual historical records, pulling up primary source documents.
Wow.
And getting those.
Wow.
Sometimes what I end up having to do, too, is actually trying to find the things that he wrote, the words that he used, the documents and paperwork that he had, so that I can get his voice involved in it as well. So that's a big part of preparing for it. And then stepping out of it is just trying to remember who I am, even though it's a descendant line. So it's still part of me, right? He passed down a lot onto me, as I've realized, but it's shaking the shoulders back a little bit and then stepping back out and back into my own body too.
Do you feel that when you're portraying him in some ways, and I'm not trying to be spooky or weird, but you touch him or you feel somehow embodied or empowered because you've gone off script and to bring up an aspect of his life that you hadn't thought about? I mean, do you sort of feel that sometimes the portrayal is bigger than what you've prepared for?
Absolutely. Just to kind of give you, first of all, I'm going to put it out there. The ancestors are at work. So when I am doing James Field, my direct descendant, I always get a little bit more than when I'm doing other characters, other people who live. But just yesterday, we did a presentation with the Defenders for Freedom, Justice, and Equality. And we've been doing this same Gabriel Forum for 17 years. This is the 17th year that we did this Gabriel Forum yesterday.
Wow.
And I portrayed James Field in the space in which he would have been captured, where he came down to Richmond during his initial escape. He made his way down to Richmond, was captured in Richmond, held in the slave jails down there before being sent back up to Hanover. And so I'm in the space on the African burial ground space where years before, 62, 63 years earlier, Brother General Gabriel, who tried to lead a slave rebellion in Virginia, was hanged and then most likely buried. And so in this entire space, I'm trying to portray this character. I'm telling the story of James Field as his detainment, his incarceration is in that spot, only spaces away from where Gabriel had been executed. Wow. And as I'm telling this story, I'm talking about how many times am I coming back to Richmond? How many times is James going to be in this space? How many times is he going to be right here to see all these spaces? And I could feel that. I could feel that being brought back, that using the place was important. And then knowing that when James does eventually return to Richmond in 1889, it's not as an incarcerated, enslaved person, but as a delegate to the Virginia General Assembly.
Wow.
And so that whole thing was brought together in that moment. And I felt that deeply in that moment last night.
Oh, man. And listen, I'm feeling the powerfulness of that. You know, a large majority of the folks who listen to and subscribe to Black Like Me are non-Black. There are folks who are really trying to understand what it is that we as Black Americans, African Americans, must navigate in order to maintain success, sanity, family, relationships in America. And so a lot of people listen in, they ear hustle to get greater insights. And so some of my friends will ask, why do you want to look back? You know, Alex, you've got a degree, your wife does, your daughter does, your mother does, your sister does. Why do you want to live in the past? And we want people to understand, we didn't just wake up overnight and arrived here. We didn't just wake up overnight and started having racist things being tweeted about Black folks and folks from other countries or indigenous people. This didn't just happen overnight. This has been building inside this country. And most of my white friends, colleagues, associates are under they're delusioned by how they're delusional about how we've gotten to where we've gotten. They just think it's really about hard work. It's really about meritocracy, the early bird gets the early worm, et cetera, et cetera. But your work in doing this as an act of public service, or the work that I'm doing by studying the life of Henderson G., who was born a slave because he's a product of a rape that took place, that helps to inform people that systems that have kept us separate and apart and weakened and impoverished is really, really old. And we can't just assume because we've had a march on Washington or a black president that all of those things are gone. And so your work is so important because it gives black people who are in the audience a chance to understand the strength of someone like Mr. Fields, but also for white people and non-black folks who would want to be allies, it gives them a chance to understand the level of brutality and then the resulting resilience among black folks. But the juxtaposition of what was put on people, the brutality, and people's ability to still come from under a beating, watching their sister being raped and elected to the House of Delegates, that just shows the untapped power, the resistance of the black soul that has been ignored, underutilized, and America has not benefited from that kind of strength in our souls. And so your story and reaching back, I feel, connects the dots for people who want to know, how did we get here and what can we extrapolate from that experience? And so we don't want to be stuck in the past by just saying this is what's happened. But there's so much strength that you've got to draw from your grandfather's story, that he went from being a slave to an elected official and a lawyer, a trained lawyer. That's got to give you strength every time you do that story. And what people have got to get out of that story is, how many young boys are in special ed? How many men are in prison? How many women are in welfare? How many folks are being devalued? And we have no idea that there's a lawyer and a House of Delegate representative inside of them because we've just delegated them to a particular role that they've been given, and we don't understand their true potential. Your story reminds us to look at people's potential because we need that potential at the table.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that is the biggest thing, too, because the story of James Apostle Fields does not just stop after the House of Delegates.
Right.
Because of what happens in the ballot box stuffing and the way that politicians in the South decided that they wanted to destroy the African-American influence, he doesn't stop. He doesn't go back. He doesn't stand for re-election and go back to the House of Delegates. What he does instead is he opens up basically a shop, more or less. Mm-hmm. His law firm sponsors and takes care of these new lawyers, these black lawyers. He helps train black lawyers after that.
That's leadership.
So that every single one of them. And I'm going to tell you this right now. According to some of the books that we've read about James Fields, apparently every single person who trained under him, every black lawyer who trained under him, passed the bar exam on their first try.
What?
He kept on going. He kept on making a way for us as we were going through it. Even though we were no longer had a political power inside the Virginia House of Delegates, he made sure that people would continue to have a voice. And so he's doing all of that work even after he's left the House. So it's an incredible, an inspirational story to me. Just like you were saying, it is about, these are people who know their worth, who know that there is worth, and then bring that out from everybody else too.
Definitely. Hey, I hope you're enjoying this segment of Black Like Me. I want to take this moment to tell you about something new that we're adding to the Black Like Me experience. I've added a Patreon page. Yeah, that's right. Patreon.com/BlackLikeMe. It allows me to really connect with the listeners more. As I've been traveling the last few months, I am meeting so many strangers who are telling me how this show is having an impact not only on their personal perspectives and lives, but their professional lives. And that means a lot to me. So we've created a number of tiers, and I think you'll like this. Cream of wheat, grits with salt level, grits with sugar, grits with shrimp and cheese, a black icebreaker level. They give folks a variety of choices depending upon what you can afford. We've been able to offer a great show to you for the past 2 years, and we want to maintain that level of professionalism while adding a few new things that I can't quite tell you yet. But please go to patreon.com/BlackLikeMe and help us take this show to another level. I grew up in Madison, Wisconsin, predominantly white. When I moved here from Chicago in 1970, I think the total minority population was about 2.5%. And so I remember the first time we talked about people who looked like me in school, it was an African with a chain around their neck. We didn't talk about the great Western civilizations and the great civilizations in Western Africa. And we didn't talk about the people like Mr. Fields and others who overcame adversity and brutality and dehumanization to become lawyers and to train a whole cadre of lawyers behind them. And so I guess what I'm saying is, we need this information in our books. Our kids being black kids, have got to stop. We've got to stop the educational system for just talking about what happened to us and how we were chained and all. We've got to be able to talk about the resilience. And I'm so proud of the historical interpretation that you're doing, because you're reminding people of not only, and I'm going to sound like I'm repeating myself, the brutality that we were oblivious to, but also the resilience that we're oblivious to. So then people have to ask the question, then, okay, so then this gentleman was a slave, and then he went to school, these historically black schools, became a lawyer and trained other lawyers. Then you move into Jim Crow in the early part of the 20th century, and it's still helping to remove the vote, to disenfranchise these black people that are making too many strides. They're getting money. They're going to want to live in my neighborhoods and marry my children. The nation continued to put up blockages to stop the black advancement. And so I need people who are listening to understand this man was a lawyer in the 1890s. And I know people are going to be listening and say, what happened? Jim Crow, separate but equal, the KKK. These things happened to stop the progress of black people in this country. And so I want them to realize that when someone becomes a lawyer today, that's not a brand new or novel thing. Black people have been practicing law in this country for 120 years at least. And your reenactment, your historical interpretation gives non-black folks a paradigmic shift, that we didn't just go from welfare to the inner cities to more deeply in the inner cities, that we were beginning to rise up on the dawn of the post-Civil War conflict. And there's extreme pressure to put on us to not let us succeed, and to really live out as fully as Americans with all rights.
Absolutely, and that is a very important thing to do too, and to think about too, because I tell the story of James Field usually in 3 separate parts, depending on where I am. If I'm talking about slavery, then I tell about his early life, from his birth in 1844 up to the time where he seizes his own freedom in 1862. If I'm talking about the period of rebirth and of growth, I talk about the Reconstruction era in Virginia, which most people think about Reconstruction, they think about it as some kind of failed experiment.
Right.
Well, first of all, let's talk about Reconstruction. The fact that there are any public schools in any of the southern states is because of Reconstruction. That is a lasting legacy that was left, primarily led by African Americans who demanded education, which had been denied for them during slavery days. So if we're looking at that, that's part of that too. So we talk about Reconstruction and education, the time where he gets to the Virginia General Assembly. And then the third part is usually this kind of heartbreaking part, because James Fields dies in 1903.
Right.
1902, the Commonwealth of Virginia adopted a new constitution, which effectively removed black power and the black vote. It disenfranchised it, and then completely, that was the official start, the constitutional and legislative start of Jim Crow.
Yes.
And so the last part that I talk about in this time as James Fields, and that third part, it's him writing his letters, talking about how successful his students have been, talking about how his family started to come up, and then expressing his sorrow and his frustration that this new constitution is seeming to threaten to take all of that away. But that his resolve is that he will insist that everyone keep on going, that we keep on moving.
Wow.
And that's been the legacy of our family. Because our family, James Fields, he dies a wealthy man. I'll be honest with you. That's not what our family has now, because intergenerational wealth did not trickle down in the way that you would like to hope. Especially because of what we were talking about, the fact that this segregation and these Jim Crow laws did not make it easy. But the passion and the drive that James Field instilled in his students existed in his family. So when my great-grandmother, Margaret Fields Johnson, and my grandmother, Margaret Margaret Johnson Cason, and my mother, Gina Cason Rogers. Right? They all have the same Fields drive that you can just see it. So it's incredible to think about that and knowing that, and that's how we're continuing to come up today. Man. So we all need to know, because we benefited. My family benefited from knowing the Fields story. And I want all families to be able to benefit from knowing the Fields story and knowing that this is something we can do and something we've been here before.
Yes. You know, even though I feel that I'm doing well in life, having known more stories, having heard more stories about people like Mr. Fields would have made me think differently as a young black man growing up in a system where I was typically one of two black students in a class. And so this is important to us, because if we don't have role models in front of us, teaching us, driving our buses, being principals of our schools, and if we're not in the textbooks, how do we ever get in touch with this? And so parents have got to grab this too, because we've got to take the responsibility of teaching this to our children if it's not in our schools. But I just want to underscore the importance of these stories. And I think part of what has young black youth spiraling is they don't understand who we've come from. And they've been given a very poisoned and tainted narrative that we were always subjugated, always less than, and that they don't understand the resilience that our ancestors exhibited, one, by just waking up every flipping day, just getting up. You know, so I just laud Mr. Fields, but our ancestors who've done this. I was part of the 1619 return to Ghana trip. About 250 of us left. We went to Jamestown, Virginia, and then went back to D.C. and flew to Jamestown and flew to Accra and visited Jamestown in Accra. And when we landed, there was a welcoming community. It's more than a community, but it was a delegation. They were singing and they were dancing and saying, "Welcome home," and they were serenading us. And in one of the slave dungeons, the tour guide said, "You Black Americans, your ancestors lived through being marched up to 300 miles chained together, living among feces and urine because they weren't allowed to bathe, and cramming men and women into spaces and beaten and raped and abused, and then branded like cattle. They survived the Middle Passage. They survived slavery and the selling and all of this. And you all have gotten degrees and jobs and bought a plane ticket and came back to Africa. You are the strongest. You are the descendants of the strongest Africans we knew." That was the first time I had heard someone say this, and certainly hearing that from West Africans, from Ghanaians. You are descendants of the strongest of the strong. To understand that our ancestors were celebrated and lauded and revered because of all that they've endured, that's empowered me to really shift my message to young black youth and to think differently each day, that I am not merely a product of people who have been enslaved. I am a product of folks who are immensely resilient. And I want to draw on that narrative and not just the narrative of what was done to us. And I feel that your work helps to really bring that to light, that it is not just about pitying people and what was done to us. We weren't slaves. We were people, human beings who were enslaved. It's what was done to us. That's not our identity. And so the resilience that existed underneath all of what our ancestors went through just means that we need to have a social and an emotional and an intellectual awakening or renewal, because the best way we can honor our ancestors is to embrace the greatness and the excellence and the resilience that's already inside of us.
Yes, absolutely.
Oh man, you get me fired up.
I'm glad. That's the work right there. That's the work working.
Yes. Listen, when you're doing your historical interpretation, do people bother you? You're presenting. Do people? I've read some things where people have tried to touch you or whistle Dixie. I'm not going to focus on that. I just want to show some of the ignorance. But does that stuff really happen while you're doing it? Do people really publicly exhibit such ignorance?
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely some people who once they see someone in what they consider a certain social status and these contexts surrounding them, they try to take on the narrative of owner, right, of master.
Wow.
Because they expect you to submit to that because you're in character, right?
Right.
And the answer is not.
Right. Don't make me take this costume off. Don't make me come off this stage.
And it hasn't happened but once.
Okay, I'm glad.
But I know that it has happened. It has happened to my mother when she has done those as well, and she has always handled it with grace and with a wit, which I find absolutely. I don't know how she does it.
Yes,
but she has done that. She has experienced it too, and I know that when people try to step out of line, that becomes a whole thing. It's not something that I'll let get to me.
Right.
And it's really something that you can shrug off, you can laugh off, because the only other response that they're going to have is start getting angry. And if they're going to start trying to get angry, well, then you don't have to stay in character.
Wow. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. That's a whole other situation. It's not something that we end up having to deal with too often, thankfully.
Right. I'm just curious. Do your black relatives, your guys, your boys you hang out with, do they ever say, "Come on, man, why are you doing this? Why are you gonna go up there and put on that costume and unlock your draw and stoop your shoulders and go into this character?" So, I mean, do you find that some folks in our community might just chide you a bit and ask, "Man, why are you getting up there doing that for white people?"
Absolutely, yeah. I've definitely had some folks ask me, "Well, I don't understand why you would do that. They don't understand why I would do these types of things," but they've also not seen my performance, which is another part, right? The reasons why we haven't as often gotten those kind of hoops and hollers and whistle and dixies as much is because we are portraying people in a state that makes them human.
Mm-hmm.
When people have thought about slavery and they're thinking, "Oh, slave." No. We're talking about enslaved person,
right?
Enslaved people.
Right.
And so when we bring that personhood and that peopleness to it, we're not walking around going, "Oh, yes, master, I'll do whatever you want." That's not what we're doing. We're actually portraying it as a person, not as a caricature. And so when people are encountering that's where they have that different type of response.
That's right. That's right. You're not putting on a minstrel show. You are redeeming the humanity of that individual.
Absolutely.
As you're telling that story. Hey, listen, just a couple of other quick questions because I don't want to hold you too long. But you've been part of the Virginia. I'm going to make sure I get the name of this right. The Virginia
Defenders for Freedom, Justice, and Equality.
Definitely. That was founded in 2002, right?
Yeah,
that's what you meant, like 17 years ago. And so even though you're working at the American Civil War Museum, you still work in this volunteer organization to help people think differently about race and racial work. Will you be able to still continue your work with the Virginia Defense in your new role at the Civil War Museum?
Yes, absolutely too. Because the reason that the defenders exist is to educate in the first place. The entire organization was built on educating the community and making sure that the information, that the knowledge is out there. I do not see a difference between the roles that I play as the education programs manager for the American Civil War Museum, speaking specifically about the American Civil War and its legacies, and the role that I play as a community educator with the Virginia Defenders for Freedom, Justice, and Equality. They are one and the same. That's
good. And last question, do you feel that you're having an impact on race relations? I mean, have white people talked to you afterwards to say, "Wow, I'm thinking about something, I see things differently"?
Yes, actually I do. I very much do. I think that there's definitely an impact on race relations as it pertains to how white folks see it and how when they interact with the programming and things of that nature. But I also, and just as we've been talking about today, the biggest impact that I see from it is actually coming from Black folks. Like, it's coming from African Americans. They're seeing it, seeing the story, hearing the story, and wanting to know more and wanting to connect with it. And so that is what I am most appreciative of. I'm very glad that white folks are also listening and that other people are doing it and going, "Oh, wow, this is definitely something I'm interested in." But I'm most excited about knowing that there are some, especially young Black men out there who are seeing that story, listening to it, and wanting to take away from it.
Sure. Do you see an openness or opportunity for youth coming up to really become involved in historical interpretation, maybe using music and other things that that's at their disposal? But are you seeing an interest in the next generation to being a part of this historical interpretation and storytelling?
If I don't see it now, I'm going to make it happen.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
That's what we're doing.
That's what I'm talking
I'm a
about.
mentor with Brothers United here at the RPS, so in the Richmond Public Schools, and so I do a lot of things working with the young brothers, and I'm hoping we're going to make it happen this way. We're going to put that in there, and so we can really instill that and grow an entire new group of living historians and historical interpreters.
Man, listen. That is so powerful. Listen, I need for us to keep in touch. There are things that I'm working on here in Madison, and I think we need to collaborate. And when I find myself out east, I've got to make my way to Virginia and to catch you. But just know this, that your work is inspiring, that I appreciate it when brothers or sisters are doing things off the beaten path, when they march to a very necessary but different beat. I appreciate the fact that you bring the life and the strength of your ancestor, but our ancestors, to life in a way that honors them and inspires us. And even though that there are people who don't get it, you know that it is important. And so this concept of historical interpretation is new to me, but the inspiration that comes from your work is not. And so I just want you to know that, brother to brother, I appreciate what you're doing, the excellence with which you're doing it. I'm glad that NBC News did a story, and I hope that your work continues to get out there more and more and more. And I hope that our paths really do cross. But I really appreciate your time, Mr. Rogers. Thank you for the work that you're doing, but also thank you for taking time from your day and your work to be on Black Like Me, to tell the nation and the 44 nations around the world that are listening about the important work that you're doing. I appreciate you. Thank you so much for being a part of our program.
Dr. G, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on, and I can't wait. Can't wait to work more with you.
Here's some real talk. Many of us who are African American are ashamed of our past because all we've really been fed are the negative aspects of our history. And as I said in the interview with Joseph, we've been told that we were slaves and not perfectly good folks who were enslaved. One defines what was done to us. The other sort of characterizes us as being just a slave, and we were more than that. And so to have this brother bring out the resilience of his great grandfather, and we all have someone like that in our families, it's really empowering. I know that as I've been on my own journey, getting to know the life and the story of my great grandfather, Henderson G., I think about his resilience and his mindset and how did he process living next door to his white father and white half siblings, but living with his black mother and knowing that he could not have the world that they had, and the strength and the stamina it took to not be destructive to himself or to others. Is just something that's really powerful. And so as I listen to Joseph Rogers tell his story, it makes me want to know more about my great-grandfather's story and how he survived. And so I know how much strength that gives me as I reflect upon Henderson G. But to have Mr. Rogers do this on a stage so that others can really engage and think differently about themselves and their history is a powerful thing. And so this is a lot to soak in. This is a really powerful and thought-provoking episode, and it just helps me to process my trip to Ghana even more deeply and the strength of my roots that I must continue to reflect upon and draw upon as I do the work of empowering African Americans, assisting African Americans live harmoniously with non-African Americans in society today. Discussions like the one I had today and reflections upon the lives of people like Henderson G. makes me want to be a stronger advocate and a stronger public servant in the community where I live and the circles where I move. And I'm hoping that you're motivated today to understand how history has impacted us today, but also how it empowers us to make the future brighter. I want to thank Corey Saffold for creating the music for this podcast, my podcast manager, Tyler Nyland, engineer and editor, Eli Steenlich, my editor, Jeremy Holliday, and a special thank you to WORT Studios, where we record Black Like Me.
Ooh, Black Like Me.
Thank you for listening to today's podcast. You can find out more about Dr. Alex G's amazing work at www.alexg.com. Black Like Me is sponsored by the generosity of the Human Family Unity Foundation.
Ooh, Black Like Me.